And it's just kind of unfortunate to have to go through this on Thanksgiving Day.
This isn't just another tragic story, it's one that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love and trust. It was a cold Thanksgiving night when everything changed. A day meant for gratitude and family unity became a scene of pure horror. The sound of children's laughter was replaced by screams. A mother and son, once safe inside their own home, found themselves at the mercy of the one person they never expected to turn on them. It happened fast. A single moment of anger, a knife, blood on the floor, and a grandmother standing over them, the blade still in her hand. Memphis, Tennessee, November 28, 2024. While families across the country gathered around dinner tables, one household descended into chaos. 55-year-old LaChunda Johnson wasn't just drunk, she was enraged. And when the argument started, she didn't just raise her voice, she attacked. Her daughter and grandson never saw it coming. By the time the police arrived, the damage was done. A mother clutching her bleeding hand, a child frozen in shock, and a grandmother fleeing into the night. This is the horrifying case of LaChunda Johnson family. It's supposed to be a source of comfort, a foundation of love and protection. But for the Johnson family, home was not always a sanctuary. Behind the closed doors of their Memphis residence, tensions ran deep, woven into years of unresolved conflict and wounds that never quite healed. At the center of it all was LaChunda Johnson, a 55-year-old grandmother who carried a presence that was both commanding and unpredictable. Those who knew her described a woman who had seen her fair share of struggles, a woman hardened by life's disappointments. But behind that exterior, beneath the weight of years and regret, was a volatile temper, one that often surfaced when alcohol was involved. For years, LaChunda battled her demons, and her drinking was no secret. It was the kind of habit that could shift the mood of an entire room. A few drinks could mean laughter and exaggerated stories, but too many, that was when the air grew heavy, words became sharp and tempers flared, and on Thanksgiving night, that very pattern would turn deadly. Her daughter, whose name has not been publicly released, had spent her adult life caught in the delicate balance of loving a mother who was difficult to love. She had seen the good and the bad. She had been on the receiving end of her mother's outbursts before, but as much as she tried to distance herself, family had a way of pulling her back in. Raising her own children, she had vowed to create a different kind of home, one where love didn't have to be tangled in conflict. But LaChunda was family, and no matter how complicated things got, she never fully shut her mother out. That's why, despite the tension, she still allowed her into their lives. Then there was the grandson, a young boy who had grown up knowing both sides of his grandmother, the one who brought gifts and called him baby, and the one whose voice could cut through the house like a knife when anger took hold. He had learned to read the shift in her mood, the way her body language changed when frustration settled in. But what he couldn't have known was that on this night, something far worse was coming. That Thanksgiving was supposed to be like any other: food, conversation, maybe a few tense moments that would eventually blow over. But something was different this time. The tension in the room was sharper, the energy heavier. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the weight of past grievances bubbling to the surface, maybe it was both. What is certain is that when LaChunda reached her breaking point, she didn't just raise her voice, she reached for something far deadlier. And in that split second, everything changed. The warmth of Thanksgiving, the scent of roasted turkey and sweet potato pie, the background hum of a holiday meant to bring families together, it all shattered in an instant. The air in the Johnson household, already thick with tension, became suffocating. LaChunda's grandson, just a child, had been lingering in the living room, watching the festivities unfold with the cautious eye of someone who had learned to be wary of his grandmother's moods. He had seen her drink before, had heard the way her voice slurred and sharpened all in the same breath. But tonight was different. Her movements were unsteady, her laughter a little too loud, her patience dangerously thin. Then, without warning, she lashed out. No one could say what exactly set her off at that moment, whether it was a comment, a glance, or simply the slow unraveling of years of buried resentment. But what mattered was that she turned on her grandson, pushing him with enough force to send him stumbling back. The room went silent. Her daughter, watching from across the kitchen, felt something snap inside her. This wasn't the first time her mother had crossed a line, but it was the first time she had laid hands on her child. That was something she wouldn't stand for. With her heart pounding in her chest, she stormed toward LaChunda, her voice rising above the clatter of dishes and the hum of the television in the background. Accusations flew between them, years of pent-up frustration spilling out into the open. "Why do you always do this? Why can't you just stop?" Lachunda, defensive and belligerent, fired back, slurring her words, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. The argument escalated at a dizzying speed. Voices clashed, anger overtook reason, and suddenly there was no going back. Lachunda was no longer just a mother being scolded by her daughter. She was a woman who felt cornered, attacked, stripped of the control she so desperately clung to. Her face twisted with fury, and without thinking, she turned toward the kitchen counter, her fingers curled around the handle of a knife. The room seemed to contract, the walls closing in as time slowed to a sickening crawl. The blade caught the dim light of the kitchen, gleaming for just a second before it cut through the air. A scream pierced through the house. Lachunda had stabbed her daughter. The pain was instant, white-hot, radiating through her body as she stumbled backward, her hands instinctively flying to the wound. But before she could react, before she could process the horror of what had just happened, Lachunda lunged again. This wasn't just a single moment of blind rage. It was something far more terrifying. It was intentional. Her grandson stood frozen, his young mind struggling to comprehend the scene unfolding before him, his mother wounded, gasping for breath, his grandmother looming over her, her face contorted with something he couldn't quite recognize, something far beyond anger. Panic set in. Despite the pain, despite the shock, her daughter knew she had to fight back. With every ounce of strength she had left, she tried to push Lachunda away, desperate to escape, desperate to protect her son from whatever was coming next. But Lachunda wasn't done. In a horrifying twist, she turned on her grandson. No one could have predicted what would happen next. No one could have imagined that this Thanksgiving, a night meant for gratitude and family, would descend into bloodshed and terror. And before the night was over, someone else would be screaming. The moment the blade made contact with flesh, a sickening silence fell over the room. It was the kind of silence that suffocates, that crushes the air from your lungs, before the realization of pain even has a chance to set in. Lachunda's daughter gasped as the knife sliced into her hand, a sharp, burning sensation tearing through her nerves. The warmth of her own blood coated her fingers, dripping onto the floor in uneven splatters, but there was no time to process the injury, no time to even cry out, because in that same instant Lachunda turned toward her grandson, his small body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to run, but fear had already wrapped itself around his limbs, freezing him in place as he watched the madness unfold in front of him. His grandmother's eyes, once familiar and comforting, were now wild, unrecognizable. The knife flashed again. Pain exploded in his hand as the blade struck near his thumb. His body jolted backward, the force of the cut knocking him off balance. A sharp cry escaped his lips, piercing through the thick tension in the room. He clutched his wounded hand, watching in horror as blood trickled between his fingers. The realization hit all at once. His grandmother, someone who had once held him as a baby, who had tucked him into bed at night, who had promised to always love him, had just hurt him. And not by accident, not in the way grown-ups sometimes got upset and said things they didn't mean. This was different, this was intentional. Lachunda's daughter, still gripping her injured hand, forced herself into motion. Her mother had already proven she wasn't thinking rationally. She wasn't stopping, wasn't hesitating, and if she didn't do something now, there was no telling what would happen next. With adrenaline surging through her veins, she lunged forward, desperate to put herself between her son and the woman who had once been her protector. But Lachunda was faster. The knife swung wildly, catching her daughter across the forearm this time. Another sharp burst of pain, another surge of blood. The walls of the home, once filled with the warmth of Thanksgiving, were now smeared with panic, with fear, with the echoes of screams bouncing off the furniture. The boy sobbed, pressing himself against the nearest wall, his small frame trembling as he cradled his injured hand. His mother was fighting, trying to push back against a force that had once been her safe haven. But Lachunda wasn't stopping. Her rage was relentless, blinding. Every emotion she had buried for years, every resentment, every unresolved fight, every moment of bitterness, had come spilling out in the most horrifying way imaginable. And now, with the taste of violence fresh in the air, she wasn't letting go. Her daughter struggled against her, trying to gain control, but the older woman had a terrifying strength, fueled by fury. Another swipe of the blade, another cut, this time grazing the side of her ribs. The pain nearly stole her breath, but she refused to let it take her down. Somewhere in the chaos, the boy's cries turned into desperate, pleading words. "Stop, please, stop." The sound of his voice, small, shaking, laced with the kind of fear no child should ever have to feel, sent a chill through his mother's body. She couldn't let this go on. With every ounce of strength she had left, she shoved Lachunda backward, sending the older woman stumbling against the dining table. Plates crashed to the floor, silverware clattering in all directions. For a fraction of a second there was stillness, and then something shifted. Lachunda's chest heaved, her grip on the knife tightening. Her eyes flickered toward the boy again, something unreadable flashing across her face. And in that moment his mother knew this wasn't over. She had to get her son out of there. But the nightmare wasn't done unfolding yet. Because as she turned toward the door, as she prepared to do whatever it took to escape, Lachunda took another step forward, and this time there was murder in her eyes. The shift in Lachunda's posture was almost imperceptible. Just the slightest tilt of her head, the way her grip tightened around the knife, how her breathing slowed as if she were recalibrating. For a split second, the room felt frozen in time, an eerie stillness stretching between them. Then, all at once, everything exploded into motion. The daughter didn't hesitate. Survival instincts overrode the pain throbbing through her wounds, and she lunged for her son, yanking him away just as Lachunda took another step forward. The boy stumbled, his feet barely keeping up as his mother dragged him toward the door. Behind them, the sound of something crashing echoed through the house. Whether it was a chair tipping over or a plate hitting the floor, she didn't care. Nothing mattered except getting out. Lachunda's voice cut through the chaos, slurred and jagged. "You think you can run from me?" The words sent a shiver through her daughter's spine, but she didn't dare turn around. There was no reasoning with her now, no pleading or begging that would reach whatever part of her mind had snapped. A sudden shriek erupted from another part of the house, one of the younger children, hiding somewhere, witnessing something they should never have to see. The walls of the home, once familiar and safe, now felt like a cage, suffocating them with the weight of what had just happened. The front door was just ahead. With every ounce of strength left in her battered body, the daughter shoved it open, nearly stumbling as she and her son burst onto the porch. The cold night air slapped against their skin, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat inside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, but the world outside seemed eerily indifferent to their nightmare. They didn't stop running. Down the porch steps, across the yard, the boy's small hand trembled in his mother's grip as they sprinted toward the neighbor's house. Lights flickered on inside as they pounded on the door, breathless, frantic. Footsteps approached from within, then the door swung open. The neighbor barely had time to react before the words spilled out. "Call the police, she's trying to kill us." It took seconds for the neighbor to process what was happening. One look at the blood, the sheer terror in their eyes, and she was already reaching for her phone. Meanwhile, back at the house, Lachunda stood motionless in the doorway. The knife was still clutched in her hand, but something had shifted. The energy that had fueled her rampage was draining, replaced by something else. Exhaustion, realization, and then, just as suddenly as the violence had begun, she turned and ran, not toward them, not to finish what she started, but away, through the yard into the night, her figure disappearing between the darkened streets of Memphis. The police arrived within minutes. Red and blue lights painted the neighborhood in frantic flashes, sirens wailing through the still air. Officers rushed toward the bloodied mother and child, assessing their injuries as other units moved toward the house, weapons drawn, prepared for a confrontation. But Lachunda was already gone. The search began immediately. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, shining flashlights down alleyways, scanning the streets for any sign of the woman who had turned a family gathering into a waking nightmare. Given her state, intoxicated, erratic, dangerous, time was critical. If she had a weapon, if she encountered someone else on the street, there was no telling what she might do next. The call came less than an hour later. A woman matching Lachunda's description had been spotted near Kazaza Road, wandering aimlessly. The responding officers moved in cautiously. Her once aggressive posture had disappeared. Now she swayed slightly, eyes unfocused, the adrenaline from the attack likely wearing off. She didn't resist. There was no struggle, no fight, no last desperate attempt to flee. When the officers approached, she simply let them take her hands, the same hands that had so violently lashed out at her own family just an hour before. As they cuffed her, one of the officers noted the dazed expression on her face, as if she were only now beginning to understand what had happened. But understanding wouldn't undo what she had done. By the time they reached the station, the charges were already being finalized. Aggravated assault, domestic assault, each one stacking against her like bricks on a crumbling foundation. She was booked at Jail East, a facility just outside Memphis, her name now etched into the system under a crime that had shattered the very people who once called her family. And as she sat in the holding cell, the weight of the night pressing down on her, one question lingered in the air. Had she meant to stop, or had she simply run out of time? The morning after the attack, the Johnson home stood eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The kitchen, once filled with the warmth of Thanksgiving, was now a crime scene. Blood stains on the floor, shattered glass reflecting the morning light, and the lingering tension of the previous night made it clear nothing would ever be the same again. News of what had happened spread fast. By sunrise, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. Some neighbors stood outside, talking in hushed voices, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others refused to believe it at all. Lashunda? No, that can't be right. She loved her family. But as the police report surfaced, detailing the brutal reality of the attack, the disbelief turned into collective horror. Reporters swarmed the area, knocking on doors, trying to get statements from those who knew the family. Some spoke cautiously, reluctant to say too much. Others were more forthcoming. One neighbor, who had known Lachunda for years, admitted she had seen warning signs but never imagined they would lead to something like this. She had a temper, sure, the woman said, shaking her head. But who doesn't? I just thought it was stress, or maybe the drinking. But this is something else. The community struggled to process what had happened. To them, Lachunda had been a familiar face, someone they saw at the grocery store, someone who waved hello from her front yard. But now she was something entirely different. A grandmother turned assailant, a mother whose rage had nearly turned deadly. The impact of that night rippled far beyond the immediate family. The 3 other children who had been in the house, hiding, watching, terrified, would carry the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. Their innocence had been shattered, replaced by the horrifying realization that the person who was supposed to protect them was capable of unimaginable violence. The legal proceedings began swiftly. Lachunda Johnson, now in custody, was charged with aggravated assault and domestic assault. She sat in her holding cell, her expression unreadable. Was she remorseful? Did she understand the full extent of what she had done? Or was she still lost in whatever rage had consumed her that night? As the case made its way through the legal system, deeper questions began to surface. Had there been signs of trouble in the past? Had there been other moments of violence that had gone unreported? Those who knew the family started to recall past incidents, small things, moments brushed aside, arguments that escalated too quickly, nights where Lachunda had been drinking, her temper flaring. But no one had expected it to reach this level. Was this preventable? Psychologists and domestic violence experts weighed in, pointing out that family violence rarely happens in isolation. There are always signs, warning signals that, in hindsight, seem painfully obvious. Substance abuse, unresolved conflicts, a history of aggression, all pieces of a puzzle that, when ignored, can lead to tragedy. But what about the victims? How did they move forward after surviving something so horrific? The daughter, recovering from her wounds, now had to wrestle with the betrayal of being attacked by her own mother. Her son, still just a child, had to make sense of why his grandmother had turned on him so violently. The emotional toll of that night would not fade easily. Therapy, support from loved ones, and time might help, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully disappear. The case struck a chord with people beyond Memphis. Online discussions exploded with debates about domestic violence, alcohol abuse, and the thin line between family disputes and outright danger. Some blamed alcohol, arguing that it had turned Lachunda into someone unrecognizable. Others believed that alcohol had only magnified what had been lurking beneath the surface all along. One question remained unanswered. Would she do it again? If that knife had landed just an inch deeper, if her daughter hadn't reacted as quickly as she did, if the neighbor hadn't answered the door, how much worse could it have been? The idea sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to think about it. Lachunda's case serves as a brutal reminder of how quickly things can escalate, how a holiday meant for gratitude and love can turn into a scene of unimaginable horror in just moments. It forces us to ask difficult questions about intervention, about recognizing the signs, about protecting those who can't protect themselves. What do you think? Could this have been prevented? Should Lachunda have been stopped long before that night, or was this an explosion that had been inevitable for years? And most importantly, how do you think the children will heal from this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that children should never have to live in fear, subscribe to the channel. Only those who think children should be hurt for fun wouldn't subscribe.